This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are talking with Professor David Mayhew about his latest book, The Imprint of Congress. David Mayhew is Sterling Professor of Political Science. He has been an American Political Science Congressional Fellow, a Guggenheim Fellow, a Hoover National Fellow, and a Sherman Fairchild Fellow, among other things. He has a long and storied career commenting on Congress. Some of his publications include Party Loyalty Among Congressmen, James Madison through Newt Gingrich, Realignments, A Critique of American Genre, and Partisan Balance, Why Political Parties Don't Kill the U.S. Constitutional System. David Mayhew, glad to have you on the program.
Glad to be here.
So thinking about your book, The Imprint of Congress, which is a crisp survey of major historical episodes throughout our nation's history and how Congress has interacted or not acted in those situations. But, thinking right now, and as you note in the book, Congress's public approval has been fairly low in the teens for a long time, maybe for decades, but yet now seems to have ebbed even lower. I was reading, I think this week, a poll that public approval of Congress is at 8%. Many other commentators, serious commentators, arguing that Congress has become a weak branch, refusing to exercise its constitutional powers. How do you see things currently for this branch of government?
Well, let's say we've had public opinion data now for about 80 years, going all the way back to the 40s, and it's very rare that Congress is way up there at the 50% mark. It's usually in the basement. It's way down in the basement right now. The 8% is very low. But there are reasons for that. I mean, Congress is kind of messy. People watching it, it's just not pleasant to see, all the fussing and the non-action and the making of the sausages and so forth. And everybody beats up on Congress. The media is one of the favorite media tropes to beat up on Congress. They love to do that. And the individual politicians beat up on Congress. As the members of Congress, they say, I'm better than Congress, basically. I'm representing you well, but Congress doesn't. So there it is. But we shouldn't take that as being dispositive of what's going on in the system. It's additionally true. There's some public opinion data on this. I put this into my book. If you ask the public at various times over the last 60 years or so, who should be making the laws? Is it the Congress or the policies? Is it Congress or the president? It's very clear that the people say Congress. I mean, they've got the basic role of the national legislature imprinted in their heads. It's also true that people are quite aware, when you put it this way, that checks and balances in the government are, generally speaking, a pretty good thing, and they're pretty aware that conflict is very natural in politics. So there it is. I mean, there it is. It's down to 8%. People kick Congress around, especially the media. They love. There must be a file somewhere in every newspaper. Congress, beat up on this week.
Yeah, I'm thinking here, some have also suggested that in recent times, maybe the last, I don't know, maybe since, particularly it was acute in the Obama presidency, but it's not just limited to that time frame, that Congress has just been weak in general, refusing to govern, happy to cede authority to the executive branch, happy to not be directly accountable to the people, but sort of to be a manager of the administrative state as opposed to a separate and equal governing body. How do you see that?
Well, there's some problems there. The ones that you specify. How new that is another matter. I mean, some of the same things were being. I go way back. Some of the same claims and cases and such were being made against Congress in the 40s and the 50s. It was just very common. It's very common. It's very easy for presidents to ask for things, but it's not so easy for 535 people to give the presidents what they want. And the activity running up to giving it or not giving it is often very messy. There we are. So whether particularly there is a problem, I just don't know. Maybe there is. I think probably one. I do see a couple of difficulties. I think there are difficulties on Capitol Hill, and these have come down during the last 25 or 30 years or so. One is on the Senate side, the filibuster processes have firmed up. Surprisingly, surprisingly, I mean, it's easier for a minority to block things, all kinds of things, generally speaking, right now in the last 25 years than it was over the previous 200 years of American history. That's very surprising. I mean, right now, you need the 60 votes to do a lot of stuff, and then a fire truck is going past. You may hear it.
That's okay.
Also on the parties on the House side, the parties have talked themselves into thinking that they should legislate only with their own party partisans and just ignore the opposition and don't try to build cross-party coalitions. There's a lot of that. That's a more common way of operating now than it was 50, 60 years ago, and that's a mistake. And it makes it difficult sometimes to do things. So for both those reasons, the filibuster processes and the strict exclusive majoritarianism on the House side, the Congress it makes it hard. And when Congress makes it a little harder than it might be, why that is an invitation to the courts and also for the White House to go it alone.
Okay.
And it doesn't look good. I think probably the public would like to see Congress as a place where they do things a little more than now has been happening. Yeah. Again, that's not entirely new. When I was a kid, that was a very, very common claim against Congress. So it's just there it is.
Thinking also, Christopher DeMuth, former president of the American Enterprise Institute, has argued in a couple of recent essays and pieces that the demise of the committee system. Of powerful committees that once exercised authority in the 1970s, and so that I guess that's when they went out of style and power, were crucial in terms of Congress's ability to leverage power within the federal government, particularly against the executive branch. How do you see that critique?
I agree with that, if I understand you correctly. Okay. I think it was a good thing for the committees, messy and sometimes killing of stuff as they were, to have a good deal of leeway on Capitol Hill, as they did in the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s, and there's less leeway now. The party leaders, the party majorities, the caucuses have got more leeway now. And I think there's something to be said for a strong committee system. And again, it wasn't just a new thing in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. You go back in American history and you find the committees in Congress to be, back over, a century and a half to be pretty powerful. Take, for example, on healthcare legislating. Where on healthcare legislating, when the government put Medicare and Medicaid on the books in the 1960s, that's under Johnson, they put that one big act, Medicare and Medicaid, they put it on the books. That was done by, or the centerpiece of the activity was in the House Ways and Means Committee. And with Wilbur Mills operating and John Burns. And John Burns, a Republican, Wilbur Mills, a Democrat. And they're very careful to craft a cross-party compromise to get that big piece of legislation put together. So the majority party, the Democrats had a lot of members, but they invited the Republicans to buy in to the crafting of that. And as a result, when Medicare was passed in the House, Medicare and Medicaid, most Republicans in the House voted for it. Of course, most Democrats did too. And that is a way to put something on the books, and that's a committee thing. That's a committee thing. The business was thrashed out in a very powerful committee. Whereas now they try to do things with simple party majorities, with the party leaders being more powerful than the committees. That was true with Obamacare in 2009, 2010. Yeah. It's true with the Republicans trying to repeal Obamacare now. And it doesn't work very well to try to do these things with strong partisan leadership, leaving the committees pretty much in the dust.
Yeah, I think the Hastert rule, as people refer to it, of you only take a vote in the House if a majority of your party, if your party can carry it over the threshold. So I've been told. Thinking about your book, The Imprint of Congress. So that's my question to you. What has been the imprint of Congress? Your book, of course, a historical survey going back to the founding. So maybe tell us that.
Well, yes, what I did in the book, I try to go beyond the lack of popularity, the gridlock. Presidents don't get to get what they want. To look at the actual effect of Congress's operations in, I think I made up 16 different patches of very important policy activities starting in 1789. Like, for example, launching a new nation, or coming up into handling the Depression in the 30s, building a welfare state, or after World War II, the generating or helping to generate prosperity for such a long time. We remember that now fondly in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. The Civil Rights Revolution, the coming of neoliberalizing the economy around 1980 under Carter and Reagan, and since then climate change, some of that, controlling the debt deficit. I look at those patches of activity to see what probably the effect has been, regardless of how messy or whatever, or whether presidents get what they want, or whether Congress is popular, what the effects of congressional, leaving aside what the presidents are up to try to see what particularly the Congress's effect on all this has been in these various times. I would say that, I would say, looking over the whole history, here are some general points about that. I think that all 1789 plus, right up to today. I mean, we're looking at the whole system now, the whole governmental system, taking a look at it, and actually putting it in a comparative perspective of the governing systems in other countries. And after all, the U.S. system is very stable. I mean, all the way, this Constitution is still there, all the way back to 1789. I think that one factor in it all is that the activities of Congress, the imprint of Congress on policy and so forth, even if Congress is down in the dumps, 8%, is generally speaking a contribution to the legitimacy of the policymaking and of the system. And that's at least for two reasons. One is that the president, the Congress is more representative than the presidency in some ways. Now, presidents have got a claim to that too, but presidents can be sectarian. They can be rambunctious. I mean, tell me about Trump right now. And the Congress, it's got 435 members, so there's a certain more comprehensiveness, inclusiveness there that is very important. I mean, it checks the presidency, and it tends to veer policy more toward consideration and deliberation, and toward probably on balance, what the median voter wants over time. I think that's true. Now, this is not to downplay presidents. Without presidents, the whole system doesn't work. You need the presidential initiative and leadership, no question about that. But the Congress is a very good balancer, even though what the Congress does is often messy. That is increments here and butting into administration and tax breaks and so on. All that. It's nonetheless the general effect over time is probably that. By the way, another point on this is that one reason for the stability, I think, and the constitutional stability over time, is that this is a presidential system, and there are a lot of presidential systems. You see in Brazil, Mexico, France, and so on. I mean, among them, surprisingly, the American system has a very strong legislature constitutionally compared with these other systems. Generally speaking, these other systems, the presidency is a good deal more powerful. The American system, a president cannot call a national referendum. I think it's a blessing that a president cannot call a national referendum all on their own hook.
Yeah,
Congress has very strong legislative and budgetary powers. That's one essay, one speech.
Yeah, no, thinking here, I mean, a political scientist, law professor, George Mason, Frank Buckley, wrote a book, The Once and Future King, a few years back, in which he argued, he's a Canadian, although an American citizen now, that the parliamentary system, just if one did an empirical study in terms of who had the freest economy right now, who had a government economy, political economy of low corruption, political corruption, that it wasn't in presidential systems, it was actually in parliamentary systems. And he included, and I always thought, maybe sort of apples and oranges comparison, because he throws in a lot of Latin American presidential countries into that mix, and you're arguing here that it's actually Congress that evens that out as opposed to these other regimes.
I think helps too. Yes, that's right. Yes, I do. I mean, the French presidency is too powerful, I think. It's just they can pretty much get what they want. And Macron is having difficulty over there now. I mean, actually, Macron's numbers are down to Trump's. He's down to 38% now after being about 2 months in office.
Yeah. So the question of legitimacy, or the theme of legitimacy, is prominent in your book. That Congress provides, even though you argue at one point, the executive branch on balance has been the chief lever in policymaking.
Yes.
And then the role for Congress is this legitimacy issue. Yes.
It balances. It balances on policy matters. It also balances the personal activity of presidents, because after all, they're individual people and they can be rambunctious.
Yeah, so I think another way you analyze the Congress in your book is this idea of impulses.
Yes.
Talk about that. Yeah.
Well, what I did there, I looked across a whole bunch of countries as peer countries at various times and looked at it this way. What am I going to look at to see what Congress has been up to? I'm going to look at patches of activity over transnationally. A lot of what happens is transnational. There are zeitgeists, there are nudges, there are fads, there are things we all think we got to do, like climate change right now. And that's the way, generally speaking, history unfolds. So you look at all these things I mentioned, the launching a new country, continental expansion, 19th century, the rise of the U.S. to foreign policy primacy or competing with other countries, handling the Depression and so forth, building a welfare state. All of those are things that have happened or tried to have happen among peer countries like Britain, France, Germany, and Japan, and the rest, Russia, China now. And so an impulse is across a whole bunch of countries. For example, good instances of impulses would be the following. One, the one that brought the Civil Rights Revolution in the 1950s and 60s. That happens all over the place. It's not just in the USA. It happens in Australia and New Zealand and Britain. The other English-speaking settler colonies, as well as Britain itself, are a good place to look, by the way, for comparisons. There's so much in common. But whenever you find an impulse, a policy impulse, like the Civil Rights Revolution, which is very basic and very important, operating in the USA, is also operating simultaneously in Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. It's virtually a certainty. Or the coming of neoliberalism around 1980, which means what? Lower taxes and weaker unions and a change in the stories about what explaining the economy. And I mean, the Keynesian explanation goes down a bit then. Deregulation, privatization, that bundle of enterprises across the world in the 1970s, 70s, and so forth. That's the U.S. It's also elsewhere. You see that in Britain. You see it in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. No question. So that was this plan to look at impulses, thus talked about, which the U.S. buys into, and which in the U.S. case we can look at what the presidency does and separately look and see what the Congress does, to see what the distinctive imprint of Congress and the American participation in such transnational impulses might be.
So you think,
in a nutshell.
Go ahead. So we're thinking here, I mean, just the deregulation impulse that you analyzed. I mean, I found that was fascinating, and just thinking about the amount of deregulatory activity that occurred, particularly in the Carter administration, because we always think of this as a Reagan administration thing, and but this is primarily initiated by the executive branch and conducted by, just given the level of administrative authority it holds over the economy.
Well, it's cooperative. I mean, for example, on airline deregulation, the Congress got into the act early on with some hearings, and Teddy Kennedy's is going ahead in favor of deregulation, or you need legislation on airline deregulation, also on trucking deregulation, also on railroad deregulation. You need stern congressional enactments there, as well as in most of those instances some administrative leadership. Also on the energy regulation, you need Congress. You need Congress along there. On the tax cuts, Reagan stands out in 1981, but there is a Congress-led tax cut in 1978, which is not trivial, and the Kemp-Roth plan, which is a blueprint in some respects for what Reagan did in 1981, comes a little bit earlier, and that is put out by these members of Congress and merchandise out there in the public in the late 1970s.
So there was just a realization at that point that Congress helped legitimate your arguing that old theories, old explanations of sort of this government-managed industrial economy no longer held, and it was able to insert itself in that space.
That's right, and also, I mean, taking the initiative sometimes. It's not just following the administration. I mean, I see what happened there. If you just look, very similar to what happened in these other countries, and it wasn't all that necessarily an ideological thing. For example, in New Zealand, then in the in the 1970s, they really went. I mean, of all these English-speaking countries, they probably went farthest.
Yes.
In deregulating their economies and cutting taxes. And that was done by a labor government, not by a conservative government.
Yeah. Well, thinking here, too, I mean, a small question for you occurs to me as we're talking sort of this great success story of Congress. Thinking about race, slavery, the Civil War. So here, my small question to you is why is Congress unable to broker a compromise prior to that conflict, prior to the Civil War? Small question.
Well, they
there.
did.
Yeah.
They did broker compromises in 1820 and 1850. Yes. You mean in the 1850s not able to? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, that's right.
As the Civil War came along?
Yeah.
I think it just became too
intensity.
difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah. What with the booming slave economy in the South, and it's just in the whole world, the slave economy of the South really stands out for expansion and success and money in the 1850s, and the pretensions and the hubris that went along with that, and some of these deep Southern states is really out of sight. And meanwhile, the North is, Ohio and Pennsylvania are building an immense industrial economy, and that's just very different. So they're just hitting up against each other right then. And I think also I really don't know. I think that the telegraph is operating there. The communications are doing better, so that everybody is aware of what everybody else is doing. And then you get particular triggering events like what is it? I've lost it in 1859, 1860,
yeah.
which the Congress, they just actually just reading last night a book about Stanton, he of the Attorney General under Buchanan, and then among Lincoln. Excellent book, and it just got out of sorts. It's just very difficult. I mean, the election comes along in 1860, and those South Carolinians, they just want to defect, so they did.
Yeah, no,
I think it was just beyond Congress. The compromise at that point was extremely difficult.
Yeah, no, I take your point. I'm curious though. You write in the book sort of about the failure of Reconstruction. And then the way in which authority was just autonomy almost was handed to the region of the South as a whole in the wake of the failure of Reconstruction. And you argue, if I read you correctly, and I thought it was interesting, maybe the alternative was another secession. Or some sort of not quasi-secession, but some sort of renewal of conflict. If that did not happen. And I thought that was interesting. So your analysis there on Reconstruction, Congress and the executive branch pushed too hard, or maybe we're up against interminable difficulty.
Yes, it was very difficult. I mean, they put the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments on the books, after all, in the 1860s. And the 13th Amendment stuck. I mean, the lasting contribution of the Civil War is to get rid of slavery. That was just done. That was never in question again, which is very basic. But the other amendments, the 14th and the 15th, they ran into real difficulty in the South. Once the Southern states came back into the Union and into Congress, and the Reconstruction legislation was done while the white South was not represented very much on Capitol Hill, which made it relatively easy anyway, to put it onto the book. Not really easy, but it made it relatively easy. But once you get those Southern states storming back into the Union, why there we are. Then the Union has got those Southern states there, and most of the Southern states had white majorities after all, except for South Carolina and Mississippi. I think they all did. Oh, it's very close to some of them. So there it was. I mean, so it's very difficult without keeping the Union Army in the South. It was very difficult to keep implementing the 14th and 15th Amendments down there successfully. So now, after all that having been said, the key again on what you said, that is, after the war, I mean, the South was largely destroyed. It's not as if they had a very strong. They were equal to the North, or close to equal to the North in power and pretension as of the 1850s. After the war, their economy was a terrible mess. So it's not as if they could gather together again and conduct another war or something, or even possibly get together for secession. However, the
guerrilla warfare.
The difference. Excuse me again.
Oh, it was guerrilla warfare during Reconstruction.
Yeah, I mean the guerrilla warfare was there, and it was quite successful in the late '60s and early '70s. No question about it. That's how the Redeemers got the deep Southern Stouts back, through guerrilla warfare, assassinations, and so on, intimidation. That's what happened, sure. But now I mean, it was not politically possible for the government, the national government, to persist in the South to keep the Union Army down there. It just wasn't support for that in the North. So the history rolled out the way it did. Yes, that's what it is, and we had a Southern racial caste system for several generations.
So thinking here too, I mean, we shouldn't ignore the role of the Supreme Court in gutting the Civil Rights Act in a series of cases, which also plays a huge role here.
Quite right. But I don't think. I mean, I think the Supreme Court largely is following the election turns by then. That there's not much. Even if they come down with their decisions, it's not clear that would make a great big difference. I think that's also true of the Senate. I mean, you say that the Senate, well, starting in 1890 or so, the Senate, they kept filibustering civil rights bills. And they did. They killed them for a long period of time. However, it's not clear to me that even if they passed them, they were implementable in the South.
Yeah. It's interesting here. Maybe we're coming full circle. We started off talking about the demise of the powerful committee system in the 70s. But, part of that was white Southern Democrats running those committees. At least I've been told. I mean, that was part of the explanation for that. And you note that system of the white Democrats chairing these committees stems from this era, this period we're talking about.
Quite right. Now, one of the features of the system was that some of those committees were guarantees of the Southern racial order, particularly the Senate Judiciary Committee under Senator Eastland. That's quite right. But otherwise, beyond that, I mean, there are committees all over the place on many subjects. The Southerners, not necessarily where race was a very big thing going on, although it touched a lot of, after all, domestic policies. The Southerners, they played a role. The Southern Committee, they played a role often of moderates in between the Northern liberals and the Republicans. That was true, for example, of Wilbur Mills on the Ways and Means Committee, whom I talked about before.
Yeah. Well, now maybe we'll start. You have a nice chapter opening the book on the first Congress. Which I thought was fascinating, and I think this is something we don't think enough about, is the role of the first Congress in really, hammering out with greater specificity some of the broad terms of the Constitution. And you note here sort of the beginning of the legitimation theme you write about in the book.
Yes, I think that's very important. I mean, James Madison was a House member, and he generated the Bill of Rights, and whenever it was, 1790 or 91, I guess 1790. He took the initiative. That was a congressional thing. And then in the mid-90s, the members of Congress, they built the Ways and Means Committee system, which allowed the House to be a fitting competitor to the executive branch with Alexander Hamilton in expertise and balancing on money matters, and that has remained the case in American history since. And they swung into the legislating in a fashion that was messy and that was, but still legitimizing, even though you put together, as with the Jay Treaty in 1796, I think I talked about, very messy. Went on for months. It's sort of like the way we handle health care now and immigration right now. Went on for months, very messy, not clear what was happening. But then they came out with a settlement, and they did it, and it stuck. It was cross-party, and it stuck. And then finally, I think I mentioned in 1801, when the election was a mess, it is Jefferson against Hamilton involving Burr on the side. Well, it was a mess. I mean, Jefferson had the mantle. I mean, he could proudly claim, and successfully so, to be the winner. But the Electoral College, tied it up, and it was the whole thing was settled on Capitol Hill, and that was a contribution.
You also note here, in addition to things being a mess, but there's also a huge political economy story of understanding of institutions being built that are going to allow for America really to outpace its rivals in terms of economic growth during the first part of the 19th century. Maybe you could talk about that.
Yes, well, I think it's very important. And political scientists tend to underemphasize that sort of thing. Political scientists like to talk about one side versus the other side, the liberals and the conservatives, the progressives and the conservatives, and all that. But a lot of the history of American policymaking is somewhat different from that. It's a positive-sum economics rather than zero-sum politics. And building a successful economy and keeping it going is an extremely important thing. I mean, it gets people out of poverty. You got an economic growth, and people come off the farms into the cities, and they're better off for doing that, and so on. I remember my grandfather, it was a terrible existence on a farm. It's before my time, but, no lights, nothing, blah, blah, blah. We have to see this. I mean, the generating of a successful economy is partly a contribution of government. Now, to be sure, the operation of a private market system is basic there, but still, the government's out there. Alexander Hamilton, building a banking system is very important, and the Congress going along with it. That was an executive initiative, though. I mean, the 1790s, if you look at economic policy, there it is. But after the Civil War, building of the post-Civil War economy, the legislating took place pretty much at the behest of Congress, and the railroads and the land grant colleges. The presidency didn't have much to do with that. It was a congressional thing.
Yeah, interesting here. I mean, so you talk about this sort of the Morrill Act, the land grant colleges, and also though this a need to sell territory. And to settlers, to bring that up, to bring that into, economic circulation. That role is interesting, I think as well, because it's, government is playing a role, but largely doing so, it seems to me, on a decentralized scale, made possible for individuals, for farmers, for families. And it seems to me that role is crucial here as well.
Well, yes. Now, the continental expansion, I wrote about that in the first half, roughly, of the 19th century, and of course, that was appalling. I mean, the way the Indians are pushed out was appalling. It's a racial disaster, like what happened with the African Americans in the 19th century. It just did that. I mean, the presidents kept seizing territory and invading land along the coast and so forth, and Jackson with his Indian removal policy, but the Congress's role in all that's presidential. The initiative went to the president. Congress's role was it was a big role in figuring out what to do with the land. I mean, once the land was taken over, then what to do. And there's hundreds of laws actually. The Congress dispensing the public domain in the first half of the 19th century. It's a major congressional preoccupation. If you're thinking about legislating in the first 50 years, it's way up there, in what Congress was up to.
I was thinking here, maybe moving forward, also the New Deal. Tremendous impulse that you analyze, and also the building of the administrative state. During this period, obviously this is a huge change in our government, a revolution really. Talk about that and how Congress saw its role in terms of really ceding away a lot of authority and building almost a new branch of government, but within the executive branch. Maybe talk some about that process and how it tried also to preserve, though, a separation of powers system, albeit by many accounts, imperfectly.
Sure, after all, in the 30s, Roosevelt, the president, is the great initiator, no question. And it actually, the recovery from the Depression, it's a White House thing, I think. And the economists are now saying that came about chiefly through Roosevelt's gyrations on money policy, that is going off the gold standard rather than through the exercise of fiscal policy. But at any rate, the initiative was the White House. Congress went along and helped a little bit on that side. Building the administrative state, well, there's an awful lot of presidential initiative there.
Yeah,
I mean, in 1933, building in agriculture and the mortgages and securities, banking, the renovation of those markets, and through the building of administrative instruments. It's cooperative. It's the White House, but there's a lot of activity of importance on Capitol Hill in the committees. For example, Sam Rayburn, before he became head of the party, the Democrats, was a major operator in the committee system and helping along that sort of thing in the 30s. Then there was Social Security in 1935, very, very big after all. That was a White House initiative. That was very, very much a White House initiative. The thing was designed, and then Congress went along. Congress is in on it, but it's very much a White House thing. And it's interesting that Roosevelt designed it in the fashion, and Congress went along with it, that attracted Republicans. That is, Social Security, as it was passed, had most Republicans in both houses voting for it, as well as, of course, a bulk of Democrats.
Your thoughts on the Administrative Procedure Act? How well has it worked? I mean, a lot of administrative legal scholars concerned about the power of the administrative state think it would be good to revise it substantially. And just because a lot of it's just ignored, or there's a lot of sort of informal exercise of power. What do you say?
Well, yes, listen, I don't know very much about that. It's not really my shtick. But I'd say this. It's 1946 they do the Administrative Procedure Act, and it's no accident that comes down at the end of the New Deal policymaking, building structures, sometimes haphazardly, of the new state, and also at the end of World War II. By that time, it had become evident to people on Capitol Hill that they needed to. The administrative branch was a bit ramshackle. They needed to make it more open, transparent, more regularized in what it was doing. So actually, the Administrative Procedure Act was a congressional initiative in 1946. It was a way to regularize the administration, which they didn't think it needed it. They thought at that point, after the New Deal and after the war. They did other comparable things at that time, like the Legislative Reorganization Act, which beefed up the congressional committees for oversight of the executive branch. They also passed the Atomic Energy Act in whatever it was, 45 or 46, which created a new committee structure to oversee that very new thing, that is atomic energy. All that was coming down. Congress is very good, very. There was compensation. They're compensating against the growth of somewhat unstructured or let loose executive power during the New Deal and the war.
Yeah, no.
And maybe I really don't know how well the Administrative Procedure Act is going now. I don't know much about it. I expect probably it could take another look, but I don't know much about it.
Yeah, I'm thinking, you referenced in the beginning of the book sort of the critique literature of your profession and thinking about Congress. And you set your book apart from that.
Yeah.
And apart from, I'm not asking you to get into the critique literature, but it is interesting that would be sort of or maybe it's not, a stable theme of academic discourse in Congress, of sort of a declinist narrative about its workings. How do you account for that? Academic literature on Congress, it was similar, after all, in the 1950s and 60s. Your typical book on the stands, written by political scientists about Congress, was slamming Congress and not working very well and wishing the presidency could get to be more powerful to compensate. That's what they were writing back then. So it's not a great big surprise that we're getting slam books still, or the broken branch.
Yeah, that's right. We're getting that now. We get a new round of broken branch type books. But there was an earlier round of broken branch type books, although not with the same title.
Yeah, it was interesting. Just the allure of power, the allure of the immense power the federal government holds in it. To my mind, it's much more clear and direct if exercised through the executive branch. And it seems that many intellectuals are drawn to that. What do you say?
You're saying back then?
Or just
that what you meant?
Ongoing, if one thinks about the declinist literature, you say we dated from, the 1950s through today, and one analysis could be, people are really drawn to the power and the allure that the executive branch has and the way in which it can exercise power versus looking at Congress, which, as you said earlier, represents all of these discrete interests, backwater interests, and it doesn't have the same cachet. And particularly moving us forward, things like that. That's that goes way back to Teddy Roosevelt in a sense. There's a kind of dazzlingness about what presidents can do. And there it is. But excuse me. Oh no, I didn't say anything. No.
Okay. Look, yes. And so look, the country needs that. The country needs executive figures who can be mobilizers and speakers and mouthers of things and initiative takers. I mean, that's very important. Without that kind of policy leadership, why the system wouldn't work very well. But that's true too. But it wouldn't work very well. But nonetheless, we do get the Congress in the background. Take this topic, immigration. All right, they may be operating again on Capitol Hill on immigration. There it is, and. Okay, that's fine, but we should realize, I mean, this, again, I'm going to say Congress is going to get slammed for what they do or don't do on immigration. But Congress has been slammed, for the most part, about what they do for 140 years. On immigration, now and then. It's a very, very difficult area to legislate in. It has a series of interests. It always has a kind of diffuse nativism out in the public that comes in, and there are nationality groups who come in, and then there are the business corporations who come in. At least those are always there at the table, and there it is. And it's just very difficult. So there's nothing new. I mean, between the 1880s and this about 34 year period. There was a lot of pressure to do immigration, big deal immigration legislation. They couldn't do it then either. It's just very difficult. I mean, the nature of the subject is it makes it difficult.
Yeah, so
it makes presidents impatient. Like Obama gets impatient. They're not doing anything, so I'm going to do it myself.
Yeah. Yeah. No, so I guess I hear you to be saying, maybe as we close, thinking about Congress, be patient. Don't get so worked up. The system isn't. If I'm reading you correctly, the system right now, as it's operating, isn't necessarily broken in terms of the interplay between Congress and the executive branch. It may be that more power than we might be accustomed to has swung to the executive branch, but Congress maybe could reclaim authority, could recover itself. This has all happened before, et cetera.
Yeah, right. Good. That's right.
Okay.
And we should realize also the media and the people who teach college courses should realize that American government is, by its nature, very messy. It's a very heterogeneous society. It's very heterogeneous, maybe more heterogeneous than any European society right now. So that dumping all these various interests and tastes into D.C. for action makes for an awful lot of jangling.
Yes. Yeah. David Mayhew, thank you so much for discussing your book, The Imprint of Congress. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Thanks for asking.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.